Greedfall 2 is right around the corner. A few weeks ago, Spiders dropped a trailer for the sequel to their breakout colonial fantasy RPG at the Nacon Direct, revealing that the game will be coming to early access this summer. The trailer itself is short and purely cinematic, but that doesn't mean that Spiders has left us without answers, as they unveiled a ton of details about Greedfall 2 and a conversation between two of the game's lead developers after the Direct. So with all of that information in hand, let's recap everything we know about Greedfall 2, The Dying World. Let's start with the trailer. As revealed in the announcement trailer back in 2022, the game will start on Tier 4D. This time, instead of playing a noble from the old continent sent to the new world, we'll be playing an islander uprooted and taken back to Nacon by the Bridge Alliance. It's a complete reversal of the plot from the first game, and should provide the foundation for a great RPG. I do have some concerns that I'll discuss later in the video, but in principle, I do think there's some strong narrative potential here. According to the post-show, our character specifically comes from a tribe that wasn't featured in the first Greedfall, but is important nonetheless. It's hard to say exactly where in the Bridge Alliance will be taken, but this looks like an observatory to me, so I wouldn't be surprised if it's Alima, the City of Stars, where Afra was born. Next, we see the stand-in for our protagonist in chains and walking amongst other islanders who've been forced to work for the bridge. The stand-in breaks free and kicks some serious ass, which most folks have interpreted to mean that Greedfall 2 will be more combat-heavy than the first installment. I'd be down for that. Greedfall's combat was, in my opinion, one of the best things about the game. But expecting the events of a cinematic trailer to carry over to gameplay is a bit of a stretch if you ask me, so we'll have to wait a bit longer to find out if that's really going to be the case. Regardless, this appears to lead to our protagonist's freedom, because the next time we see them, they're looking down at the aftermath of a battle, where the bodies are piled on top of each other in horrific fashion, in a manner that reminds me of stories from the American Civil War. A creature that looks like a combination of Yorm the Giant and High Lord Wolnir from Dark Souls 3 rises from the corpses, and though this is purely speculative, this might be an indication that the constant wars between the factions have taken a toll on Nacon. One of the key themes of Greedfall 1 is the symbiotic relationship between the Islanders and Enon Milfrictamen, the god of Tier 4D, so it would make some sense that Greedfall 2 would do the reverse, and focus on the damage Thélème, the Congregation, and the Bridge Alliance have done to the spirit of their homeland. Our protagonist arrives, flanked by 3 companions. Right away, folks wondered if this meant that the party size would be increased from 3 to 4, and Spiders has since confirmed that this is indeed true. I'm a big fan of this move. 4-member parties are just perfect for RPGs, for both narrative and gameplay. In Greedfall 1, there were several quests where I wanted to bring Petrus and Siora, both spellcasters, along with me, because it made the most sense for the story. A good example of this is anything involving the settlement of New Eden, where Thélème has set up a town right next to a native village. But as someone who played a gun build, it left me vulnerable anytime I got into combat. With 4-member parties, it should be easier to accommodate both the companions you need for the story and those you need for a fight. The trailer ends with the announcement that the game will be coming to early access sometime this summer. During the post-show, Spiders shared a bit about how this will work. Early access will be limited to PC, and it sounds like it will consist of at least 2 separate builds of the game. Saves, unfortunately, won't carry over between builds nor to the full game, and though this will no doubt frustrate many, myself included, the reality is that Spiders is looking for feedback on all aspects of Greedfall 2, story, gameplay, narrative design, and graphics during the early access period. Thus, it's possible that entire quest lines with branching choices will change between builds, and there'd simply be no way to translate all of that to the finished product. I mean, imagine if you were one of the few players to kill a character that Spiders, based on player feedback, decided to keep alive, or simply if the consequences of an early game decision changed during the late stages of development. If the team is going to effectively respond to community feedback, this is probably necessary. In taking this early access approach to the game, Spiders is clearly trying to replicate the success of Baldur's Gate 3, which cleaned up at the Game Awards after releasing under a similar format. Whether or not they'll have a similar result remains to be seen, but I, for one, will be interested to see how it turns out. In terms of early access content, we'll be getting access to the opening salvos of the main quest, our tribal lands on Tier 4D, and 2 regions called Uxantis and Thynea. I'll bet that those are nations that fall under the Bridge Alliance banner. As touched on at the beginning of the first Greedfall, the Bridge Alliance is a group of nations united together, in a manner reminiscent to the real-world Ottoman Empire. The Bridge Alliance's ambassador made it sound like all of these nations get along incredibly well, but that's surely propaganda. It's purely speculation, but honestly, I wouldn't be shocked if we spent most of Greedfall 2 in the territory of the Bridge Alliance. At its height, the Ottoman Empire included countries like Greece, Egypt, modern-day Iraq, and even Romania. So there's probably enough diversity in the Bridge Alliance to make several distinct biomes, and one only needs to look to the story of Vlad the Impaler or the events leading up to World War I to know that there was just about always some level of tension between the various vassals and provinces of the Ottoman Empire. We could easily spend much of the game dealing with these tensions, making allies and enemies of the diverse nations within the bridge. Perhaps they'll be dealing with a civil war and will be forced to take sides. In terms of other information covered in the post-show, the developers clarified that the game will not be open world and will instead retain the region-based structure of Greedfall 1. They also mentioned that although no characters from the first installment will return in a major capacity, they are going to try and work in some cameos if possible. In fact, they went as far as to describe Greedfall 2 as a story that happens alongside of or at the same time as the first game, instead of a sequel or a prequel, which is really interesting. It makes me curious about what they might be planning for the future of this franchise. All in all, I'm pretty pleased with most of this news. I enjoyed the first Greedfall, but I thought that the story needed some polish and more self-awareness in terms of how it confronted the topic of colonization, particularly on the back end. Which brings me to the first of 2 concerns I do have about the game at this point. As a student of history, you can't look at this image and not think of the transatlantic slave trade. Greedfall is set in a fantasy version of the Age of Discovery, and the reality is that this time period was terrible for indigenous people. Early on, I felt that Greedfall did a decent job of confronting this historical truth. The Battle of Red Spears is a good example of this, as it demonstrates the desperate lengths native people often went to in order to stop the evils of colonization. And despite the focus on diplomacy and maintaining positive relations with all parties, the opening hours of Greedfall drew attention to de Sardet's naivete and the unscrupulous sides of each of the major factions. Hunting down Dr. Asili for the Bridge Alliance and confronting the Inquisition for Ptolemy really stand out in this regard, as it allows you to both increase your reputation with each faction and improve them from the inside, while also covering the ways both religion and nationalism led to the oppression of indigenous peoples. Still, both questlines left some lingering issues, like the manipulative way New Eden was founded in the first place, and Governor Burham's startling incompetence. At about halfway through the main plot, right after Treason, which is by far the game's best quest, Greedfall, in my opinion, started to fumble the ball on these topics. We learned that the Malachor is a curse literally brought about by colonization, which is a fantastic metaphor. But there's not much engagement with this revelation, as the game ushers us towards a climax that preaches the importance of all factions coming together to fight a common enemy, which is something that never worked out well for indigenous people. And if you don't pick the High King who favors peace, then de Sardet, your literal player avatar, will openly criticize your decision later in the game. I have no idea why the developers did this. It's a betrayal of the concept of an RPG and presents a ton of thematic issues at the same time. Don't get me wrong, I loved the way that Constantine, a rejected prince from the old world, ended up becoming a living vector for the curse of colonization, but I wish that Spiders had handled the faction's role in it differently. After all we saw on Tier 4D, the game's best ending feels like wishful thinking, and a situation that will inevitably put the Islanders at greater risk down the line. All of this is to say that if we're going to be playing a protagonist who is taken from their homeland and captured by colonizers, then Spiders needs to make sure that they approach this topic with the honesty and sensitivity it requires. My other concern is the simple fact that we haven't seen any gameplay yet. We've had 2 cinematic trailers, but we don't know if there have been any major changes to the art style, what the combat is going to look like, or if they've added a true dialogue wheel as opposed to the 2 options Desarde usually had. All of this does temper my expectations a bit, as it's hard for me to get truly excited about a game until we've seen some actual gameplay. Hopefully a true gameplay trailer isn't too far away. In the meantime, stay tuned for more news and updates on Greedfall 2. Thanks for watching. Huge shout out to my Silver and Gold tier channel members and Patreon subscribers, including James Pruitt, Raven Lampkin, Corey Matson, Gustavo Balaby, Little Caesar, Reed, and Pythonian, who receive early access to these videos thanks to donations of $5 to $10 a month. See you guys next time.